The scorching Arizona sun beat down on the weathered roof of Sarah Mitchell's isolated homestead as she hung the last of her washing on the line. A light breeze carried the scent of creosote and dust across the yard, offering momentary relief from the relentless heat. Sarah paused, wiping perspiration from her brow with a sun-browned forearm, her keen blue eyes scanning the distant horizon where the Dragoon Mountains rose like sentinels against the endless sky. 5 years on this hardscrabble ranch had taught her to read the land's subtle warnings. Most folks in Copper Springs dismissed her vigilance as unnecessary worry, but Sarah knew better. In these contested borderlands, survival depended on observation and preparation. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. Her gaze lingered on the rocky outcropping half a mile from her property. Something had moved there moments ago, a shadow that didn't match the natural patterns of the landscape. She squinted, hand instinctively drifting toward the Colt revolver holstered at her hip. The movement didn't repeat, perhaps just a coyote or javelina seeking shade from the midday heat. Sarah returned to her chores, but her senses remained alert. The territory was increasingly dangerous as tensions between settlers and Apache bands escalated following the recent cavalry raid on a peaceful camp. Many in town called it justice. Sarah called it what it was, a massacre of women and children. That would only fuel more violence. Inside her modest home, everything had its place. Dried herbs hung from the rafters, filling the air with earthy aromas. Shelves of preserved foods lined the kitchen wall, each jar meticulously labeled in her neat handwriting. The rifle above the hearth gleamed in the light filtering through. Cotton curtains, cleaned and loaded as it was every evening before sunset. The ranch had been her husband, Thomas's dream. When fever took him 3 winters ago, the townsfolk expected her to sell the property and return east to her family in Boston. Instead, Sarah had surprised everyone by keeping the land, learning to manage the small herd of cattle and defending her right to independence with quiet determination. "You're just asking for trouble living out here alone," Marshal Wilson had warned during his monthly patrol last week. "These are dangerous times, Mrs. Mitchell. Apache raiding parties have hit 3 homesteads north of here. You should consider moving into town until things settle." Sarah had thanked him for his concern, while politely declining his advice. The town's protection came with constraints she wasn't willing to accept, particularly the persistent pressure to remarry one of the eligible bachelors who circled her like vultures, awaiting a feast. The distant sound of hoofbeats interrupted her thoughts. Sarah moved to the window, watching as a cloud of dust announced a rider approaching from the direction of Copper Springs. She recognized the distinctive gait of Edmund Carter's bay gelding well before the banker came into view. Sarah sighed, reaching for her bonnet. Carter had been Thomas's closest friend in life, and in death had appointed himself her unofficial guardian. His intentions were transparent to everyone in Copper Springs. His wife had passed 2 years before Thomas, and he considered Sarah a suitable replacement, despite her consistent refusal of his awkward courtship attempts. "Sarah," he called, dismounting with the stiffness of a man more accustomed to sitting behind a desk than on horseback. "I've brought mail and supplies." He removed his hat, revealing a shock of prematurely white hair that contrasted sharply with his sun-reddened face. "That's kind of you, Edmund," Sarah replied, stepping onto the porch, "though I wasn't expecting a delivery until next week." Carter shifted uncomfortably, his formal attire ridiculous in the harsh desert setting. "The town council met yesterday. I felt you should hear the news directly." Sarah raised an eyebrow, but said nothing as she accepted the parcel he offered. Experience had taught her that silence often revealed more than questions. "There's been another attack," Carter continued, his voice dropping as though the empty landscape might be listening. "The Peterson place, just 15 miles north of here. Everyone's dead. Livestock taken, buildings burned. The Petersons had a government contract to supply beef to Fort Bowie," Sarah observed quietly. "They were underpaying local Apache scouts and cheating on their deliveries." Carter's expression hardened. "That doesn't justify butchery, nor does it justify assumption," Sarah countered. "Rustlers and outlaws are just as likely." "It was Apaches," Carter interrupted firmly. "Army trackers confirmed it. The council has requested additional cavalry protection. In the meantime, we're organizing volunteer patrols." He paused, clearly uncomfortable with what came next. "Sarah, the council strongly recommends you relocate to town. Temporarily, of course." Sarah's spine straightened imperceptibly. "And I strongly decline, Edmund. This ranch represents everything Thomas and I built together." "Thomas would want you safe," Carter persisted. "At least accept some protection. Young Taylor Crawford has volunteered to stay here as a guard. He's a good shot and has made his interest in me and this property abundantly clear." Sarah finished for him. "No thank you, Edmund. I have my rifle, my revolver, and my wits. They've served me well these 5 years. Carter's frustration was evident in the tight line of his mouth. "This isn't stubbornness for its own sake. The situation is deteriorating. You're isolated out here." What Sarah didn't say was that isolation was precisely what she valued. In town, her every move was scrutinized, her independence viewed as an affront to proper society. Here, she answered to no one. The townsfolk tolerated her because she provided medicines from herbs she cultivated, skills learned from an elderly Mexican woman who had stayed with her during her first difficult winter alone. "I appreciate the council's concern," she said. Finally, her tone indicating the discussion was over. "If you're truly worried about my safety, you might mention to Marshal Wilson that it's been 3 months since his last patrol out this way." After Carter finally departed, casting worried glances over his shoulder as he rode away, Sarah returned to her chores with redoubled focus. The news of the Peterson attack was troubling, though not for the reasons Carter assumed. If the cavalry increased their presence in the territory, it would only escalate the cycle of violence. As evening approached, Sarah completed her daily security ritual, checking the perimeter of her small property, securing livestock in the corral nearest the house, and preparing her weapons for the night. The desert transformed in the fading light, shadows lengthening as the heat of day surrendered to the coming cool of night. Sarah lit the lamp at her kitchen table and opened her journal, recording the day's events as she did every evening. Thomas had encouraged the habit, saying a person's memory was like quicksilver, slippery and prone to reshape itself with time. The written word provided anchor points for truth. Just as she finished the entry about Carter's visit, her border collie, Rusty, raised his head from his spot by the door, ears pricked forward in alert attention. A low growl rumbled in his throat. Sarah extinguished the lamp immediately, moving silently to retrieve her rifle. Years on the frontier had taught her that animals often detected threats long before humans. The moonless night offered perfect concealment for anyone approaching with ill intent. She waited in darkness, listening intently. For several minutes, the only sounds were the normal night chorus of insects and the occasional distant yip of coyotes. Then came a sound that didn't belong, the faint scrape of something dragging across rocky ground near her storage shed. Sarah moved to the window, careful to stand to the side rather than silhouette herself against the interior. At first, she saw nothing in the deep shadows beside the building. Then a darker shape separated from the blackness, a figure hunched low, moving with obvious difficulty. Her finger tensed on the rifle's trigger as the intruder stumbled into a shaft of starlight. It was a man, clutching his side where a dark stain spread across his buckskin shirt, As he collapsed against the wall of the shed, Sarah caught a glimpse of his face, distinctly Apache, young, with features contorted in pain. Rusty growled again, louder this time. The wounded man's head snapped up, eyes scanning the darkness toward the house. He attempted to push himself upright, but faltered, sliding back to the ground. Sarah's mind raced through her options. The logical choice, the one anyone in Copper Springs would make without hesitation, would be to shoot the intruder, or at minimum keep him at gunpoint until help could arrive. Apache warriors had indeed been responsible for attacks on isolated homesteads, regardless of her reluctance to jump to conclusions with the Petersons. Yet something in the young man's desperate movements gave her pause. He was severely wounded, likely unable to pose any real threat. And there was something else. He wore a tattered remnant of a cavalry scout's bandana around his neck. The army employed Apache scouts from neutral or allied bands, men who often found themselves caught between two worlds, trusted by neither. For reasons she couldn't fully articulate, Sarah made a decision that ran counter to everything the frontier had taught her about self-preservation. Setting her rifle aside, she lit a small lantern and stepped onto the porch. "I know you're there," she called firmly. "I'm coming out. I have a gun, but I don't intend to use it unless you force me to." The wounded Apache remained motionless as she approached cautiously, Rusty staying close at her heels. As she drew nearer, the extent of his injuries became apparent. A deep knife wound in his side, a bullet grazed across his upper arm, and multiple contusions on his face and torso. He'd been systematically beaten before making his escape from whatever situation had left him in this condition. His dark eyes followed her movements with the wariness of a trapped animal. When she knelt beside him, he tensed, hand moving toward, a knife at his belt. "I'm not going to hurt you," Sarah said, keeping her voice steady. "You're injured. Let me help." The young man's expression remained guarded, but his hand dropped away from the weapon. He spoke a single word in Apache, then switched to heavily accented English. Why help? It was a fair question, one Sarah wasn't entirely sure she could answer. "Because you need it," she said simply, "and because that's an Army Scout's bandana you're wearing." A flicker of something crossed his face, surprise perhaps that she had noticed this detail. He nodded once, a barely perceptible movement. "Was a scout for Captain Reynolds, Fort Bowie." Sarah's mind worked quickly. Captain Reynolds had a reputation as one of the few army officers who treated his indigenous scouts with respect. If this man had served under him, it partially explained the situation. "What's your name?" she asked, already examining the wound in his side with clinical detachment. He hesitated before answering. "John." Then, seeing her skeptical expression, he added, "White name, given at mission school, Apache name." He winced as she probed the wound. "Naicho, means strong." "Well, Naicho, you're going to need to be strong," Sarah replied, making a quick decision. "This wound needs cleaning and stitching. Can you walk if I help you?" He nodded grimly, and with considerable effort, they managed to get him inside the house. Sarah's practical nature took over as she gathered her medical supplies, knowledge gleaned from her father, a physician in Boston, enhanced by local remedies she'd learned in Arizona. "What happened?" she asked as she cleaned the knife wound, trying to distract him from the pain. Naicho's breathing was labored, but his voice remained steady. "Cavalry raid 3 days ago, at my people's camp. I was not there, on a scout mission. When returned, found," his voice faltered, "women, children dead, my brother's wife, his son. Soldiers said camp harbored warriors who attacked settlers." "The massacre near Whitetail Creek," Sarah said quietly. She'd heard whispers about it in town, accounts that contradicted the official story. "But you're wearing a scout's bandana. Why were you attacked?" Bitterness flashed in his eyes. "New lieutenant said Apaches can't be trusted anymore, that we help raids by giving information. Ordered scouts disarmed. Those who resisted, he gestured to his wounds. I escaped. 3 others did not. The implications were disturbing. If the army was turning on its own scouts, the delicate balance that had prevented all-out war in the territory was disintegrating. And if Nicho's account of the massacre was accurate, the violence would only escalate as surviving Apache warriors sought vengeance. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. You're not safe here, Sarah said as she finished bandaging his wounds. If they're looking for you— No one saw me come, Nicho interrupted. Traveled only at night. Avoided trails. He studied her face with unexpected intensity. Why do you help? Your people hate Apache. Sarah considered her answer carefully. Some do. Others understand that hatred only breeds more hatred. She thought of Thomas, who had believed in finding common ground with the indigenous people whose land they now occupied. My husband traded fairly with your people before he died. He believed peace was possible. Nicho seemed to weigh her words before speaking again. My brother Nantan is war chief now. After the massacre, he will seek a blood price. His expression darkened. Many will die unless the truth is known. What truth? Sarah asked, sensing they had reached the heart of the matter. Massacre was not mistake, was planned to start war. Nicho's voice lowered. Lieutenant Barrett takes Apache scalps, pays men who bring them, wants all Apache dead or on reservation where land can be taken. Sarah felt a chill despite the warmth of the room. She had heard rumors about Lieutenant Barrett, a Southerner who had fought for the Confederacy before joining the frontier army. His hatred of indigenous people was legendary, as was his ambition to clear the territory for mining interests. You need evidence, she said, the implications becoming clear. That's why they tried to kill you. You witnessed something. Nicho nodded slowly. Have proof, hidden. His eyelids were growing heavy as exhaustion and blood loss took their toll. If Nantan finds proof before finding vengeance, maybe fewer die. Sarah helped him to a pallet she'd prepared on the floor of her root cellar, the coolest and most concealed part of the house. As she ascended the ladder, closing the trapdoor behind her, the enormity of what she'd done struck her with full force. She had just hidden an Apache scout in her home during a time of escalating violence. If discovered, she would be branded. A traitor at best, a collaborator in attacks against her own people at worst. The evidence Nicho mentioned might prevent broader bloodshed, but only if it reached the right hands before Barrett's provocations triggered full-scale war. As she secured the house for the night, Sarah's gaze fell on Thomas's portrait above the mantel. His kind eyes seemed to meet hers with the same steady confidence he'd shown in life. I hope I'm doing the right thing, she whispered to the empty room. I hope you'll understand. Outside, an owl called from the darkness, its mournful cry carrying across the desert. In the distance, a coyote answered, the sounds merging into the night symphony that had become the soundtrack of her frontier life. But tonight, those familiar sounds carried new meaning, harbingers of decisions made that could not be unmade, and consequences that would soon emerge from the shadows like dawn breaking over the unforgiving Arizona landscape. Dawn broke over the Dragoon Mountains, painting the sandstone cliffs in hues of amber and gold. Sarah had slept little, her rest fragmented by the weight of her decision and the need to check on her patient throughout the night. Nicho had developed a fever, not unexpected given his injuries, but concerning nonetheless. In the grey light of early morning, Sarah collected fresh water from the well and gathered herbs from her garden. The desert plants she'd cultivated contained powerful medicine, creosote for infection, Mormon tea to reduce fever, and prickly pear to draw poison from wounds. She'd learned which local plants could heal and which could harm through careful observation, and the teachings of Maria Vasquez, the curandera who had shown her kindness when others in town kept their distance. As she prepared a poultice, Sarah's thoughts turned to the practical challenges ahead. Hiding Nitro would require careful planning. The root cellar provided good concealment, but food, water, and medical attention would need to be provided without arousing suspicion should anyone visit, and someone would visit. Edmund Carter's concern, however self-serving, was genuine enough, that he would likely return within days to check on her. Then there was Marshal Wilson's irregular patrol and the increased military presence Nitro had warned about. Sarah descended the ladder to the root cellar, lantern in hand. Nitro lay where she had left him, though his eyes opened immediately at her approach. Despite his weakened state, his awareness remained sharp, the instincts of a scout and a hunted man. "Fever needs breaking," she said, setting down her supplies. "I've brought medicine." Nitro watched as she mixed dried herbs with water to create a bitter tea. "Medicine woman," he observed quietly. Sarah shook her head. "Just knowledge passed down. My father was a physician in Boston. He taught me the basics of healing before I came west. The rest I learned here, from the land and from a Mexican healer, who showed me which plants the desert offers to those who understand." She helped him sit up enough to drink the tea, noting how he winced at the movement. The knife wound had been deep, though thankfully it had missed vital organs. The bullet graze on his arm was less serious, but would need careful watching for. "Infection. Your people will look for you," she said as he drank. "It wasn't a question." Nitro nodded. "My brother will search, but carefully. He knows the army hunts surviving scouts." "This proof you mentioned," Sarah pressed gently. "What exactly is it?" The Apache was silent for a long moment, clearly weighing how much to trust her. Finally, he reached beneath the bandana at his neck and withdrew a small object wrapped in oilskin. Unwrapping it carefully, he revealed a military insignia, a lieutenant's bars, and a folded paper. "Found after the massacre. Lieutenant Barrett dropped this when collecting scalps." His voice remained steady, but his eyes reflected deep rage. "Contained beneath discipline. Paper has names, payments, scalps delivered and price paid." Sarah felt her stomach turn as she examined the document. It was a crude ledger containing dates, names, and amounts. Some entries simply listed buck, squaw, or child with corresponding prices. Most disturbing were entries marked friendly with higher values assigned. "He's paying for scalps of friendly Apaches," she whispered, the horror of it sinking in. "Even children." "To make war," Nitro confirmed. "Barrett wants Apache land for mining friends. Needs reason for the army to remove all Apache from territory." The implications were staggering. If Barrett succeeded in provoking a full-scale Apache uprising, the military response would be overwhelming. Every band in the territory would be hunted down and forced onto reservations. Exactly the outcome mining interests had been pushing for. "This needs to reach proper authorities," Sarah said, carefully refolding the paper. "Someone who will act on it rather than bury it." "Captain Reynolds," Nitro suggested. "Honest man. But at Fort Bowie, 3 days' ride." Sarah nodded thoughtfully. "And you can't travel in your condition. Even if you could, you'd be shot on sight." The problem seemed insurmountable. She couldn't leave Nitro alone for 3 days to ride to Fort Bowie herself, nor could she risk sending the evidence with anyone from town who might examine it, or worse, be complicit in Barrett's scheme. "First you must heal," she decided, returning the evidence to his keeping. "Then we'll find a way to get this to Captain Reynolds." As she rebandaged his wounds, applying the poultice of desert herbs, Sarah felt a strange sense of purpose she hadn't experienced since Thomas's death. For 3 years, she had simply existed, maintaining the ranch, defending her independence, finding meaning in small daily victories against the harsh land. Now, suddenly, her actions had consequence beyond her own survival. "Why you risk Nicho asked abruptly. Your people kill you if discover. The question gave Sarah pause. Why indeed was she risking everything, her safety, her property, her standing in the community, for this man and his cause? Because what Barrett is doing is wrong, she answered finally. And because too many people look away from wrong when confronting it is difficult or dangerous. She secured the last bandage before continuing. My husband believed justice matters more than convenience. I try to honor that belief. Nicho studied her face with that same intensity he had shown the previous night. After a moment, he reached for his knife, a movement that made Sarah tense instinctively, but instead of wielding it as a weapon, he used it to cut a small strip of leather from his belt. With practiced fingers, he quickly wove it into a simple but distinctive pattern. Apache symbol of protection, he explained, offering the small token. If my people find you, show this. Tell them Anai Nicho means Nicho's brother. Sarah accepted the gift with appropriate solemnity, understanding it represented a trust as significant as the one she had extended to him. Rest now, she instructed, gathering her supplies. I'll return with food later if anyone comes to the house. I will be silent as shadow, Nicho promised, his eyelids already growing heavy as the herbal tea took effect. Sarah ascended the ladder and secured the trapdoor, carefully arranging the rug over it. As she moved through her morning chores, feeding livestock, collecting eggs, tending the garden, her senses remained heightened, every distant sound drawing her attention. By midday, the heat had become oppressive, the air shimmering above the baked earth. Sarah was mending a shirt on the porch, strategically positioned to observe approaches from all directions, when she spotted dust rising from the trail leading toward town. Her first thought was that Edmund Carter had returned as expected, but as the riders drew closer, she recognized the distinctive blue uniforms of cavalry soldiers. 3 riders, moving at a determined pace directly toward her ranch. Sarah's heart hammered in her chest, but her face remained composed as she set aside her mending and stood to meet the approaching patrol. Rusty positioned himself at her side, sensing her tension. The lead rider was unfamiliar, a young lieutenant with a precisely trimmed mustache and cold eyes that assessed her property with calculating efficiency. The insignia on his uniform matched the one Nicho had shown her. Lieutenant Barrett. Mrs. Mitchell, he called, reining in his horse. Lieutenant James Barrett, 6th Cavalry. We're conducting a security sweep of outlying properties. That's considerate of you, Lieutenant, Sarah replied evenly. Though Marshal Wilson usually handles local security matters. Barrett dismounted, with fluid grace that spoke of a man comfortable with his authority. His 2 companions, a weathered sergeant and a younger private, remained mounted, their posture alert. These aren't usual times, ma'am, Barrett said, removing his hat with practiced courtesy that didn't reach his eyes. We've had reports of hostiles in the area, Apache renegades, including some former scouts who've turned against the army. Sarah maintained a neutral expression. I've heard about the Peterson attack, a terrible business. Indeed. Barrett's gaze swept the ranch buildings with professional assessment. You're quite isolated out here, Mrs. Mitchell. The army is concerned about the safety of citizens in outlying areas. I appreciate the concern, but I manage well enough. She gestured toward the house. Would you and your men care for water? The ride from Fort Bowie is a dusty one. Barrett smiled thinly. Thoughtful of you, ma'am, but we're not stationed at Bowie. My company's establishing a forward camp near Copper Springs to address the Apache threat more directly. The implication was clear. Barrett was operating with considerable autonomy, away from the oversight of Fort Bowie's command structure, and away from Captain Reynolds, who Nicho had indicated would oppose his methods. Have you observed any unusual activity recently? Barrett continued. Any signs of Apache movement near your property? Perhaps items missing that might have been taken? Nothing missing, Lieutenant, Sarah answered truthfully. And no sign of Apache activity. This, too, was technically true. Nacho had come to her property, not raided it. Barrett nodded, though his eyes continued to assess the surroundings. One of our scouts deserted 3 days ago. Apache fellow, likely headed back to his people with information about army movements. Dangerous situation. If you see any sign of him or any other Apache, you're to report it immediately. Of course, Sarah agreed, maintaining her composed demeanor despite the cold fear gripping her spine. Though I can't imagine why a deserter would come this way, rather than heading directly for Apache territory in the mountains. Apache scouts know the territory intimately, Barrett replied. He might take an indirect route to avoid pursuit. His gaze sharpened. The man is a traitor, Mrs. Mitchell. He abandoned his post after an engagement with hostile forces. That makes him an enemy combatant, to be dealt with accordingly. The deliberate mischaracterization of what had happened, Nacho hadn't deserted, but escaped execution, confirmed everything the wounded scout had told her about Barrett's duplicity. I understand, Lieutenant. I'll be vigilant. Barrett seemed about to say more when his attention was caught by something near the corral. Interesting tracking method you've employed, Mrs. Mitchell. Sarah followed his gaze and felt her blood freeze. Near the water trough were distinctive markings in the dirt, circular patterns she had not made, clearly left by Nacho during his approach to her property the previous night. Old Apache trick, Barrett continued, studying the marks with narrowed eyes. Creates a safe approach path that avoids triggering alarms or traps. He looked back at her with a new assessment. Unusual knowledge for a rancher's widow. Sarah forced a casual shrug. My husband traded with peaceful Apache bands before the troubles started. Picked up a few of their methods. Those marks help me track which direction my cattle wander when they escape the corral. For a tense moment, Barrett's gaze held hers, skepticism evident in his expression. Then he nodded slightly, replacing his hat. We'll continue our patrol, Mrs. Mitchell. Remember, any sign of Apache activity is to be reported immediately, for your own safety. His tone carried a subtle threat beneath the concern. The sergeant here will provide you with our camp's location. The older soldier dismounted briefly to hand Sarah a crudely drawn map showing the position of Barrett's new encampment, close enough to her ranch that a patrol could arrive within an hour if summoned. As the soldiers departed, Sarah maintained her composed expression until they disappeared from view. Only then did she release the breath she'd been holding, her hands trembling slightly as the danger of the encounter registered fully. Barrett was hunting Nacho specifically, not just any Apache scouts who had escaped the massacre. He suspected, or at least considered the possibility, that the scout might have come this way, and he had noticed the tracking marks, connecting them immediately to Apache methods. The lieutenant was more dangerous than she had initially realized, observant, intelligent, and deeply suspicious. If he returned with more questions or decided to search the property, Sarah pushed the thought aside, focusing instead on immediate concerns. She needed to warn Nacho about Barrett's patrol and proximity, and she needed to accelerate his healing so he could travel as soon as possible. The evidence he carried had to reach Captain Reynolds before Barrett's campaign of provocation triggered the full-scale war he was clearly working to instigate. When she descended to the root cellar later that afternoon, she found Nacho awake and alert despite his fever. One look at her face told him something had happened. Soldiers, she confirmed before he could ask. Lieutenant Barrett himself, with 2 others. They're looking for you, specifically. Nacho's expression darkened. He fears what I know, what I can prove. He's established a camp near Copper Springs, less than an hour's ride from here. Sarah showed him the map the sergeant had provided. This changes everything. We need to get you mobile phone as soon as possible. Not yet strong enough, Nacho admitted with evident frustration. Wound still bleeds inside. Need 3 days, maybe 4. Sarah paced the small confines of the cellar. We may not have 4 days. Barrett noticed Apache tracking marks by the corral. He's suspicious already. Nitro considered this information with the calculated assessment of a scout accustomed to evaluating tactical situations. He will return, he concluded. Maybe not tomorrow, but soon, with more men to search. Then we need a better hiding place, Sarah decided. Somewhere they won't think to look, even if they search the property thoroughly. She described the layout of her ranch, the small caves in the nearby hillside where she stored equipment, the false wall in the barn where Thomas had once hidden valuable tools from raiders, the dry well behind the house that had been covered over but never filled. Nitro listened carefully, then shook his head. Soldiers know to check such places. Barrett is thorough hunter. He was right, of course. Any hiding place on the property would be discovered in a proper search, especially one conducted by a man as determined as Barrett. What about away from the ranch? Sarah suggested. There's a line shack about a mile south used for sheltering hands during roundup. It's well hidden, in a gully. Again, Nitro shook his head. First place they check when expanding search. Frustration mounted as each potential solution revealed new problems. The reality of their situation was becoming clear. There was no truly safe place to hide Nitro if Barrett returned with a proper search party. As darkness fell outside, Sarah lit the lantern and studied the wounded scout's face. Despite the fever and pain, his eyes remained clear and focused. This was a man accustomed to calculating survival odds in harsh conditions. "What would you do?" she asked finally. "If you weren't injured? How would you evade Barrett's patrols?" A ghost of a smile touched Nitro's lips. "Move at night. Use water paths to hide tracks. Go where soldiers fear to follow." Water paths, Sarah repeated thoughtfully. "You mean the canyon system that runs east of here? Where does Rattlesnake Creek flows?" Nitro nodded. "Apache travel. Canyon in darkness. Rock holds no tracks. Water erases scent. Many hidden caves cavalry cannot find." The canyon he referred to was a notorious maze of twisting passages and sheer rock faces about 3 miles from her property. Local settlers avoided it due to the treacherous terrain and rumors of it being sacred Apache ground. The army rarely ventured there, preferring to patrol the more open desert where their horses and superior weapons gave them tactical advantage. "Could your brother find you there?" Sarah asked, the beginnings of a plan forming in her mind. "Nantan knows old ways, old places," Nitro confirmed. "If leaves sign, he will find." It was dangerous, perhaps foolishly so, but it offered a solution to their immediate problem. If they could move Nitro to the canyon before Barrett returned with a search party, the evidence might remain safe until either the scout was strong enough to travel to Fort Bowie or his brother found him. "Tomorrow night," Sarah decided. "If your fever breaks and you can travel a short distance with support, I'll take you to the canyon entrance. There's a cavern system near the first waterfall that few white settlers know exists." Nitro studied her face with that now familiar intensity. "Dangerous for you. If caught helping Apache." "They already suspect me," Sarah replied, her voice steady despite the fear curling in her stomach. "Barrett saw the tracking marks. He'll be watching regardless of what I do now." She straightened her shoulders, decision made. Better to act while we still have some advantage of surprise. As she ascended the ladder, leaving Nitro to rest, Sarah felt the weight of consequences settling over her like an approaching storm. The path ahead was fraught with danger. Not just physical threat, but the certainty that she was crossing boundaries that would forever mark her as separate from her own community. Yet there was a strange liberation in that knowledge. The frontier had already shaped her into someone unrecognizable to her Boston family, A woman who could defend her own property, birth a calf without assistance, and face down armed men with steady composure. This new challenge was simply another evolution, another step away from the constraints of what others believed possible or proper. Outside, the desert night enveloped the ranch in velvet darkness, punctuated by stars that seemed close enough to touch. Somewhere in those same hills where she planned to hide Naicho, his brother Nantan was perhaps already gathering warriors for vengeance, unaware that the evidence that might prevent unnecessary bloodshed lay wrapped in oilskin beneath a scout's bandana. Sarah stood on her porch, listening to the night sounds of the desert, the distant howl of coyotes, the rustle of creatures in the brush, the whispering wind through creosote and sage. Tomorrow night she would venture into that darkness with a wounded Apache scout, risking everything in the hope that justice might prevail over hatred. For now she could only prepare, gathering supplies, planning their route, and strengthening her resolve for what lay ahead. The road to the canyon would be just the beginning of a journey whose end she could not yet foresee, but whose necessity she felt with bone-deep certainty. The day passed with excruciating slowness as Sarah prepared for their nighttime journey. Each task required careful consideration: what supplies were essential, how to transport Naicho without worsening his injuries, what evidence to leave behind should anyone come looking for her. Throughout the day, she made deliberate visible trips to the garden, the barn, and the storage shed, establishing normal patterns of movement that any observer would recognize as routine. Between these visible activities, she quietly gathered what they would need: a small medical kit, dried meat and hardtack that would sustain them without requiring cooking, water skins, and a few small tools that might prove useful. Naicho's fever had broken by mid-afternoon, a promising sign. When Sarah checked on him in the root cellar, she found him sitting up, methodically testing his range of motion despite obvious pain. "The herbs work," he acknowledged as she changed his bandages. The wound looked better, still angry and raw, but with healthy pink edges rather than the infected red of the previous day. "You'll need your strength tonight," Sarah cautioned, noting how he winced when he rotated his torso. "The canyon is 3 miles from here, across difficult terrain." "I will manage," Naicho replied with quiet confidence. Wounded Apache can still outpace cavalry in darkness. As they prepared, Sarah shared what she knew of the canyon system, the narrow entrance that would be difficult to spot in darkness, the series of shallow pools formed by seasonal runoff, and the cavern she remembered from a rare exploration with Thomas during their first year on the ranch. "Few settlers venture there," she explained. "There are stories about it being sacred ground, haunted by Apache spirits." A hint of amusement flickered in Naicho's eyes. "Stories my people encourage. Good way to protect important places from those who do not respect them." As the sun began its descent toward the western horizon, Sarah completed her final preparations. She dressed in her most practical clothing: sturdy trousers usually reserved for cattle work, a dark shirt that wouldn't reflect moonlight, and well-worn boots that knew the contours of the land. Around her neck, hidden beneath her collar, she placed the protective token Naicho had created. Her revolver was secured at her hip, and a knife was strapped to her boot. In a saddlebag packed for their journey, she included a small looking-glass, not for vanity, but as Thomas had taught her, for signaling in emergencies. Dusk arrived with a spectacular display of color that gradually faded to deep blue, then to the velvety blackness of a desert night. Sarah waited until full darkness before retrieving Naicho from the root cellar. She had decided against using horses, which might leave trackable evidence of their departure. Instead, she had fashioned a travois that she could pull herself, allowing the injured scout to conserve his strength. "We'll follow the dry creek bed east," she explained, as she helped him settle onto the travois. "It adds some distance, but provides better cover and softer ground." Naicho nodded, his dark eyes reflecting starlight. Creek bed also catches the key. Night wind carries scent away from the ranch. Good choice. With Rusty ranging ahead as a silent sentry, they began their journey. Sarah pulled the travois with determined strength, her body accustomed to physical labor after years of managing. The ranch alone. The night was mercifully clear, with enough starlight to navigate without a lantern that might betray their position. The first mile passed without incident, the relative flatness of the terrain allowing steady progress. Sarah maintained awareness of their surroundings with the heightened senses of someone whose survival had long depended on reading subtle changes in the environment. Every rustle of nighttime creatures, every shift in the wind carried information. As they approached the second mile, the land began to rise, rocky outcroppings replacing the gentle slopes of the creek bed. Here, Sarah was forced to abandon the travois, helping Nicho to his feet. The Apache scout moved with surprising strength considering his injuries, though she could sense the tremendous discipline required to control his pain. Barrett will have patrols watching the main trails, Nicho observed quietly as they paused for water, especially those leading toward mountains where my people camp. This route isn't on any maps, Sarah assured him. Thomas discovered it hunting mule deer. It crosses through a boundary dispute area that neither the army nor the local ranchers claim responsibility for patrolling. They continued their careful progress, navigating around thorn bushes and loose scree that might create noise. The rising moon cast just enough light to reveal the dangerous drop-offs that began to appear as they neared the canyon entrance. When they finally reached the narrow opening in the rock face that marked the canyon's entrance, Sarah felt a wave of relief. The worst of their exposed journey was behind them. Once inside the twisting confines of the canyon, they would be much harder to track or spot. The passage narrowed dramatically as they entered, forcing them to proceed in single file. Smooth rock walls rose on either side, stretching upward until they framed only a narrow strip of star-filled sky. The air grew cooler, carrying the faint mineral scent of hidden water. "Sacred place," Nicho murmured, his voice echoing slightly in the confined space. "Many generations of my people have sought visions here," Sarah nodded, understanding the reverence in his tone. Even to her outsider's perspective, there was something profound about the canyon's presence, a sense of age and power that transcended human concerns. They continued deeper, following the curving path as it wound between towering walls of striated rock. Occasionally, Sarah would check their position against her memory of the place, searching for familiar landmarks in the ghostly moonlight that filtered down from above. After nearly an hour of careful navigation, they reached the series of stepped pools that Sarah remembered. Water trickled softly from one natural basin to another, creating a melody that seemed to emanate from the rock itself. "The cavern should be just ahead," she whispered, pointing to a dark recess in the canyon wall. Behind that fall of rock. As they approached, Rusty suddenly froze, hackles rising along his spine. A low growl rumbled in his throat, barely audible over the water's gentle music. Sarah and Nicho both went still, senses straining against the darkness. For several heartbeats, there was only silence beyond the water's movement. Then came a sound. The subtle shifting of weight on stone, the whisper of leather against rock. Someone was in the cavern ahead. Nicho's hand moved to the knife at his belt, his body tensing despite his injuries. Sarah drew her revolver, stepping slightly forward to place herself between the injured scout and whatever waited in the shadows. "Who's there?" she called, her voice steady despite the fear coursing through her. "Show yourself." There was a moment of continued silence, then a match flared in the darkness, illuminating a face that made both Sarah and Nicho freeze in surprise. Edmund Carter stood in the cavern entrance, a small lantern now casting a circle of yellow light around him. His city clothes were rumpled and dust-covered, his normally immaculate hair disheveled. "Sarah," he acknowledged, his expression unreadable in the flickering light. "I had hoped I was wrong." Sarah kept her revolver trained on him, mind racing. "How did you find us?" "I didn't track you here tonight, if that's your concern," Carter replied, his tone oddly formal given the circumstances. "I've been watching your ranch since Lieutenant Barrett's visit yesterday. Saw his interest in those markings by your corral. When he returned to town, he was asking questions about you, your habits, your sympathies." "So you decided to spy on me?" Sarah's voice hardened, though a chill ran through her at the news Barrett had been asking questions in town. Carter stepped forward, moving fully into the lantern light. "I was concerned, Sarah. Barrett isn't just some army officer following orders. He has powerful connections with mining interests who want the Apache removed by any means necessary." His gaze shifted to Naicho, who remained poised for action despite his injuries. "When I realized you were hiding someone, I guessed you'd bring him here if Barrett's suspicions grew too strong." "You knew about this place?" Sarah asked, still not lowering her weapon. A sad smile crossed Carter's face. "Thomas showed it to me once. Said if there was ever real trouble, this canyon provided the best natural defense in the territory." He paused, gaze returning to Sarah. "I'm not here to arrest you or to alert Barrett, if that's what you're thinking." "Then why are you here, Edmund?" Sarah asked, suspicion evident in her tone. Carter set the lantern down on a flat rock before responding. "Because I made a promise to Thomas before he died, that I'd look after you, not as a suitor, though I'll admit that hope has lingered, but as a friend who respects what you two built together." His voice softened. "Thomas believed in fair dealings with the Apache. He would have done the same as you, given the circumstances." Naicho spoke for the first time since Carter's appearance. "How do we know to trust Banker Man? Could bring soldiers. Once we are found, it was a valid concern, one Sarah shared. Carter had always been closely aligned with the town's business interests, many of which stood to benefit from Apache removal." Carter reached into his coat and withdrew a folded paper. "Because I've seen enough to understand what Barrett is doing, and I know it's wrong." He handed the document to Sarah. "This is a copy of a contract between Barrett and several mining companies. They're paying him personally, outside his military salary, to facilitate access to lands currently within Apache territory." Sarah unfolded the paper, angling it toward the lantern light. It was indeed what Carter described. A legal agreement promising substantial payment to Barrett upon successful removal of Apache obstacles to mining operations. "Where did you get this?" she asked, stunned by the evidence of corruption. "The bank handles accounts for most businesses in the territory," Carter explained. "Barrett was careless, opened an account under his own name for the first payment. When I saw the unusual deposit and its source, I made inquiries. The mining consortium mistook me for a potential investor and shared details they shouldn't have." Sarah studied Carter's face, searching for signs of deception and finding none. The banker had always been overly formal, sometimes insufferably proper, but never dishonest in business matters. "The army would court-martial Barrett if they knew," she said, lowering her revolver slightly. Carter nodded. "Which is precisely why I'm here. Your Apache friend isn't the only one Barrett wants silenced. 3 days ago, my assistant was beaten severely after asking questions about Barrett's account at my direction. The message was clear. The lieutenant has powerful friends who will eliminate anyone interfering with their plans." Nicho stepped forward, moving with deliberate control despite his injuries. "You have proof of the massacre, of scout killings?" "Not directly," Carter admitted. "But I have financial records showing Barrett received a substantial bonus the day after the massacre at Whitetail Creek. The timing is unlikely to be coincidental." Sarah and Nicho exchanged glances. Combined with the scalp payment ledger Nacho carried, Carter's financial evidence created a compelling case against Barrett. "We need to reach Captain Reynolds at Fort Bowie," Sarah said, finally holstering her revolver. "He's known to be honorable, unlikely to be involved in Barrett's scheme." Carter frowned. "Reynolds has been reassigned, or at least that's what Barrett announced in town yesterday. Supposedly transferred to Fort Laramie in Wyoming Territory. Convenient timing," Sarah observed grimly. "Removed because he would not support a false campaign against my people," Nacho added, his expression darkening. "Barrett eliminates those who stand in way." The implications were disturbing. If Barrett had managed to have Reynolds reassigned, his influence reached higher in the military hierarchy than they had assumed. It might not be enough to simply present their evidence to the next officer in the chain of command, the territorial governor, Carter suggested. "He's due in Tucson next week for a meeting with tribal representatives. Barrett's mining friends want him to approve new boundaries that would remove Apache from lands with known silver deposits." Sarah considered this option. The governor might listen, especially if presented with evidence of a military officer conspiring with private interests and instigating attacks for personal gain. "Tucson is 6 days' hard ride," Nacho pointed out. "My brother may not wait that long before seeking vengeance for massacre." He looked troubled. "Nantan will have gathered warriors by now, may already be planning strikes against settlements." The gravity of their situation settled over the small group. They had evidence that could potentially prevent a territory-wide conflict, but no clear path to deliver it to authorities who would act appropriately, and limited time before the cycle of violence Barrett had initiated spiraled beyond control. "We need a new plan," Sarah said decisively, "one that addresses both immediate and longer-term threats." In the confined space of the canyon cavern, the three unlikely allies began to formulate a strategy. Carter's unexpected appearance had changed the dynamic significantly, providing both additional evidence against Barrett and a potential connection to official channels that neither Sarah nor Nacho could safely access. "Barrett will be watching all roads to Tucson," Carter noted. "He has men stationed at key crossings, ostensibly to protect travelers from Apache attacks." "Then we don't use roads," Nacho replied simply. "Apache paths through mountains faster. Anyway, 6 days becomes 4 for those who know the old ways." Sarah nodded slowly, an idea taking shape. "Edmund, you need to return to town as if nothing has changed. Maintain your normal routine, prevent Barrett from becoming suspicious of your involvement." Carter looked skeptical. "And leave you alone out here." "Sarah, that's necessary," she interrupted firmly. "You're more valuable as our connection in town. You can monitor Barrett's movements, perhaps even delay him if necessary. And what will you and—" He gestured toward Nacho, clearly uncomfortable using the Apache's name. "Nacho," Sarah provided firmly. "His name is Nacho." Carter nodded, stiffly. "What will you and Nacho do while I'm playing spy in town?" Sarah exchanged glances with the Apache scout before responding. "We need to make contact with his brother, Nantan. Prevent retaliatory attacks while we work to expose Barrett's scheme." Carter's expression shifted to alarm. "You want to meet with an Apache war chief? Sarah, that's madness. They'll kill you on sight." Nacho shook his head. "Not if she carries a token of protection." He indicated the woven leather band Sarah wore. "And not if I'm there to speak for her." "You're still too injured to travel into the mountains," Sarah reminded him. A ghost of a smile touched Nacho's lips. "Don't need to go to the mountains. Nantan is already here." This revelation stunned both Sarah and Carter. Nacho continued, his voice low and confident. "My brother would have scouts watching all the settlements after the massacre. When I did not return to the meeting place, he would begin searching. By now, his warriors are positioned throughout the territory, observing, waiting for his command." "How can you possibly know that?" Carter asked, disbelief evident in his tone. Because it is what I would do in his place, Naicho replied simply, and because I know my brother. Sarah considered this information. If Nantan's warriors are already in position, the situation is even more precarious than we realized. One incident could trigger attacks across the entire territory, Naicho nodded gravely, which is why we must reach him first, before Barrett creates the incident he hopes for. How do we signal him? Sarah asked. How do we arrange a meeting without risking interception by Barrett's patrols? Naicho's gaze moved to the canyon walls surrounding them. This place, sacred ground, my people check such places regularly, especially in times of conflict. Leave. A sign here, proper sign, and a message will reach Nantan. Carter looked unconvinced. And you believe he'll agree to meet rather than simply attack after what happened at Whitetail Creek? My brother is war chief because he is both fierce and wise, Naicho replied with quiet dignity. He will listen before acting if he knows I am alive and have important information. The plan taking shape was dangerous beyond measure for all of them. Carter risked being identified as a traitor to the community if his assistance became known. Sarah risked not only her life, but the complete destruction of her reputation and standing. Naicho risked being labeled a traitor by his own people if they misunderstood his actions. Yet the alternative was worse, a territory-wide conflict that would cost countless lives on both sides and ultimately lead to the destruction of the Apache way of life, all engineered by a corrupt army officer and his mining partners. I'll need to return to my ranch briefly, Sarah decided. There are supplies we'll need for an extended stay here, and I should create the appearance of normal activities in case Barrett has men watching the property. Carter nodded reluctantly. I'll head back to town first. Maintain my usual schedule. If Barrett asks, I'll mention seeing your lamplit last night as I passed by. Suggest you're simply continuing your normal routine despite the Apache threat. Naicho, who had been examining the cavern with a scout's practiced assessment, rejoined them. This place, good for healing, for waiting. Has water, defensible position, multiple escape routes. He pointed to a narrow fissure at the rear of the cavern. That opening connects to higher passages, can observe approaches without being seen. The three continued developing their strategy as night deepened around them. By the time false dawn began to lighten the eastern sky, they had established a plan with clear responsibilities for each participant. Carter would return to town, gathering additional evidence of Barrett's corruption while monitoring the lieutenant's activities. Sarah would retrieve essential supplies from her ranch, then help Naicho create the signs that would hopefully bring his brother to the canyon for a meeting. Meanwhile, Naicho would use the protected environment of the cavern to continue healing, regaining strength for what might lie ahead. As Carter prepared to leave, gathering his lantern and straightening his rumpled clothing as best he could, he turned to Sarah with uncharacteristic emotion in his expression. Thomas would be proud of you, he said quietly. He always said you had more courage than anyone he'd ever known. Sarah felt a tightness in her throat at the unexpected words. Thank you, Edmund, for understanding, for helping. After Carter departed, following Sarah's guidance on the least visible route back toward town, she turned to find Naicho watching her with thoughtful assessment. Banker man loves you, he observed matter-of-factly. Sarah sighed, settling onto a flat rock at the cavern's entrance. In his way, perhaps, though I think it's more the idea of me that appeals to him, the respectable widow who would bring social standing to his household. Naicho lowered himself carefully beside her, mindful of his healing wounds. He came to dangerous place, alone to warn you, shows true heart beneath formal words. It was an unexpectedly perceptive observation from someone who had only just met Carter. Sarah found herself nodding slowly in agreement. Edmund has always been bound by conventions, but yes, there is a good heart there. She watched the growing light illuminate the canyon walls. People are rarely exactly what they first appear to be. Nicho followed her gaze to where the rising sun was beginning to paint the upper reaches of the canyon in gold and amber hues. Like this place, seems like a trap, walls closing in, no escape, but actually a sanctuary for those who understand its nature. As the new day fully arrived, bringing with it both promise and peril, Sarah felt a strange sense of clarity despite the dangers that surrounded them. The path ahead was uncertain, fraught with risks that could not be fully calculated or controlled. Yet she knew with bone-deep certainty that she had chosen correctly, that standing against Barrett's orchestrated conflict was worth whatever personal cost might come. Beside her, Nicho began carefully arranging small stones in a pattern that would be meaningless to most observers, but would carry clear significance to his brother's scouts. The message taking shape was simple but profound. Meet, listen, there is another way. Whether that message would be received and heeded before violence consumed the territory remained to be seen. For now, all they could do was continue their dangerous work and hope that wisdom would prevail over vengeance. The journey back to her ranch tested Sarah's endurance and caution. Without Nicho to worry about, she made better time, but the rising sun increased the risk of discovery. She moved through arroyos and dry washes wherever possible, using the terrain to shield her progress from distant observers. Upon reaching her property, Sarah implemented the plan they had devised. She made visible, normal preparations as if preparing for a typical day, feeding livestock, hanging laundry on the line, carrying water from the well. Anyone watching would see routine activities suggesting she had spent an ordinary night at home. While performing these visible tasks, she discreetly gathered the supplies they would need: additional bandages and medicines for Nicho's wounds, food that would sustain them for several days, ammunition for her revolver, and a small mirror for signaling if necessary. Each item was carefully hidden in a feed sack that would draw no attention if she carried it to the barn. Around midday, Sarah tensed at the sound of approaching horses. Moving casually to the front porch, she watched as a small patrol of cavalry, soldiers, passed on the main trail, not turning toward her property. Their presence confirmed Barrett was maintaining surveillance of the area and reinforced the danger of her planned return to the canyon. As the afternoon sun began its westward descent, Sarah completed her preparations. She had decided to depart before dusk, contrary to conventional wisdom that would suggest traveling under cover of darkness. Her reasoning was strategic. Barrett would expect anyone moving secretly to travel at night, so his patrols would be most vigilant after sunset. By traveling during the transition period when sunlight was fading but full darkness had not yet arrived, she might exploit a gap in their surveillance. Sarah secured her home, leaving small indicators that would suggest to any observer that she planned to return shortly. A kettle positioned near the hearth, a book open on the table. Then, with Rusty at her side and the supply sack slung over her shoulder, she slipped away from the ranch, through a narrow ravine that ran behind her property, a route invisible from the main trail. The return journey to the canyon took longer than her night travel with Nicho, as she was forced to move with extreme caution, stopping frequently to listen for patrols. The lowering sun cast long shadows across the landscape, creating natural camouflage that aided her progress. As she approached the canyon entrance, Sarah noticed fresh horseshoe prints in a patch of soft ground, cavalry mounts, judging by the distinctive pattern. Barrett's men had been here, possibly drawn by Carter's departure that morning. The realization sent a chill through her. If they had ventured into the canyon, moving with heightened caution, Sarah entered the narrow passage, Rusty proceeding ahead as a silent scout. The dog's relaxed posture as they progressed deeper reassured her somewhat. If soldiers remained within, Rusty would have detected their scent and grown alert. When she finally reached the cavern, relief washed over her at the sight of Nicho, seated calmly at the entrance, fashioning a small wooden implement with his knife. He acknowledged her arrival with a slight nod. "Soldiers came," he confirmed before she could ask. 3 riders remained at the canyon entrance, did not venture deep, appeared to be routine patrol rather than focused search. Sarah set down her supplies, stretching muscles tightened by tension and exertion. "Barrett's net is closing. The frequency of patrols has increased since yesterday. He suspects but does not know," Nicho observed, returning to his carving. "Dangerous time, waiting for mistake that will confirm suspicions." As Sarah unpacked their supplies, she assessed Nicho's condition. The day's rest had clearly benefited him. His movements were more fluid, less guarded against pain. The herbal poultice she had applied to his wound was working effectively, drawing out infection and promoting healing. "Your strength is returning," she noted with professional satisfaction. Nicho tested his arm's range of motion before responding. "Apache heal quickly when necessary. Body understands when survival depends on strength." As evening settled fully over the canyon, they shared a simple meal of dried meat and cornbread Sarah had brought from the ranch. The small fire they risked was positioned deep within the cavern, where its light wouldn't betray their presence to anyone passing the canyon entrance. "What is the sign you created for your brother?" Sarah asked as they ate. "How will he know? To come here specifically?" Nicho indicated the small arrangement of stones he had placed near the water pools outside their cavern. "Marks of our family line, combined with symbols for parley and urgency. Any scout from our band will recognize the meaning. Bring word to Nantan." "And you're certain he'll come, rather than simply sending warriors to investigate?" "If he knows where I live, he will come himself," Nicho replied with quiet confidence. "Brotherhood oath requires it." Sarah studied the Apache's face in the soft firelight. Despite days of pain and danger, his expression remained composed, reflecting an inner discipline that impressed her. She had encountered many Apache during her years on the frontier, but always at a distance defined by mutual suspicion. Nicho was the first she had come to know as an individual rather than as a representative of a feared other. "Tell me about your brother," she said, genuinely curious. "What kind of man is Nantan?" Nicho considered the question carefully, as he seemed to consider everything, weighing implications before responding. "Nantan is like a mountain lion," he said finally. "Patient hunter, watches long before striking, fierce in battle but prefers wisdom to unnecessary bloodshed." A hint of rare emotion colored his voice. "Our father was a great chief before the army killed him during peace talk. Nantan carries father's wisdom and mother's fire. Will he listen to evidence against Barrett before seeking vengeance for Whitetail Creek?" "If I ask, yes." Nicho's certainty was absolute. "Nantan understands wider war benefits no one except those who profit from Apache removal. But he will demand justice for those killed." The implications were clear. Even with evidence of Barrett's corruption, some form of retribution would be necessary to satisfy Apache concepts of justice. The challenge would be channeling that retribution toward the truly guilty, rather than allowing it to spread to innocent settlers. As night deepened, they took turns standing watch. Though the canyon provided natural protection, both recognized the foolishness of complacency. Barrett's patrols might return, or Nantan's scouts might arrive without warning. During her watch, Sarah found herself reflecting on the extraordinary circumstances that had brought her to this moment. 5 years ago, she had been the proper wife of an army captain turned rancher, hosting occasional dinner parties for neighboring settlers and carefully maintaining connections to civilization despite frontier hardships. Now she sat in a sacred Apache canyon, armed and vigilant, allied with a man whom society branded her enemy, awaiting the arrival of a war chief who might determine the fate of the entire territory. The transformation seemed impossible, yet each step along the path had followed naturally from the one before it. When Naicho relieved her at midnight, Sarah settled onto her bedroll, but found sleep elusive. The weight of what they were attempting pressed heavily on her consciousness. So much could go wrong. Barrett might discover their location, Nantan might reject their evidence, the territorial governor might dismiss their accusations against a U.S. Army officer. Yet beneath these specific concerns lay a deeper uncertainty. If they succeeded and Barrett was exposed, what would become of her? The community would never understand or forgive her actions, regardless of their justification. She would be permanently marked as an Apache sympathizer, a traitor to her race and society. The ranch she had fought so hard to maintain would become untenable as a home. Even if she retained legal ownership, the social isolation would be complete. The fragile niche she had carved for herself as an independent widow would collapse under the weight of accusations and suspicions. Sleep finally claimed her as these thoughts circled without resolution. Her dreams were fractured images of pursuit and hiding, of faces that shifted between friend and foe without warning. Dawn arrived with gentle illumination that gradually filled the canyon with amber light. Sarah woke to find Naicho already alert. His attention focused on the canyon entrance. "Someone approaches," he said without turning. "Single rider moving cautiously." Sarah reached for her revolver, moving silently to a position that offered both concealment and a clear view of the approach path. Through the narrow opening that framed the canyon entrance, she could make out a mounted figure advancing slowly along the twisting path. "It's Edmund," she said with surprise, recognizing the banker's distinctive posture even at a distance. Something must have happened for him to return so soon. They waited as Carter navigated the increasingly narrow passage, eventually dismounting. To lead his horse through the final approach to the cavern, his expression was grim, his normally immaculate appearance disheveled by hard riding. "Barrett knows," he announced without preamble as he reached them. "Not everything, but enough. He's convinced you're hiding the Apache scout and has ordered a comprehensive search of all properties within 20 miles of town." Sarah's mind raced with implications. "How much time do we have?" "The search begins at noon. He's assembled a force of 20 men, half cavalry, half civilian volunteers." Carter removed his hat, wiping perspiration from his brow. "They're dividing into 4 groups to cover more ground. Your ranch is in the first sector they'll search." "What about this?" "Canyon?" Naicho asked, his tone revealing nothing of the concern he must feel. Carter shook his head. "Not specifically mentioned in the plans I overheard. Barrett seems focused on buildings and developed properties rather than natural features. But that could change if they find sign of your departure from the ranch." Sarah exchanged glances. With Naicho, the situation was deteriorating faster than they had anticipated. If Barrett's men conducted a thorough search of her property, they would inevitably discover evidence of Naicho's presence, the medical supplies she had used to treat him, perhaps traces of blood in the root cellar. "We need to accelerate our plans," she decided. "Has there been any word about the territorial governor's visit to Tucson?" "Arriving in 4 days, according to the latest telegram," Carter confirmed. "But Barrett is already moving to influence the meeting. He sent a detailed report about supposed Apache atrocities to be presented before the governor meets with tribal representatives." This news added urgency to their already precarious situation. If the governor received Barrett's fabricated account first, he would be predisposed to disbelieve any contradictory evidence they might later present. "Has there been any sign of Nantan's scouts?" Sarah asked Naicho. The Apache nodded solemnly. "Sign was acknowledged during the night. Message taken. Now we wait for a response." Carter looked skeptical. "And if Barrett's search parties find this place before your brother responds?" "Then we fight or flee," Naicho replied simply. "Canyon offers advantages to those who know its paths, many ways to disappear if necessary." The three spent the next hour revising their strategy in light of Barrett's accelerated timeline. Carter would return to town to continue monitoring developments and, if possible, subtly misdirect the search efforts. Sarah and Naicho would prepare for either Nantan's arrival or the need for immediate evacuation deeper into the canyon system. As Carter prepared to depart, he hesitated, clearly troubled by unspoken concerns. "Sarah," he began awkwardly, "if this goes badly, if Barrett discovers your involvement before we can present our evidence—" "I understand the risks, Edmund," she interrupted gently. "Do you?" His voice was uncharacteristically emotional. "Barrett isn't just some overzealous officer. He's a killer who's become very skilled at making murder appear justified. If he connects you to this Apache scout, he won't simply arrest you. He'll create a narrative where your death was necessary and unavoidable." The starkness of the assessment hung in the air between them. Sarah had recognized the danger intellectually, but Carter's words crystallized the personal threat Barrett represented. "I can offer you safe passage," Carter continued. "My bank has connections in California. If we leave now, travel through the night, we could reach the stage depot at Crawford Station by morning. From there, I can't abandon this, Edmund." Sarah interrupted, her voice gentle but firm. "Whatever happens, I need to see it through." Carter studied her face for a long moment before nodding reluctantly. "Then at least take this." He reached into his coat and withdrew a small Derringer pistol. "Keep it concealed, as a last resort if all else fails." Sarah accepted the weapon, tucking it into her boot where it would remain hidden but accessible. The gesture touched her, practical, thoughtful, and free from the condescension that typically characterized men's concern for her welfare. "Thank you," she said simply, "for everything." After Carter departed, Sarah and Naicho set about preparing for the various scenarios that might unfold. They assembled small caches of supplies at strategic points deeper in the canyon, ensuring they could retreat quickly if necessary. Naicho familiarized Sarah with additional escape routes, showing her narrow fissures in the rock that led to higher passages and eventually to the rim rock above the canyon. "Your banker friend cares deeply," Naicho observed as they worked. "Risks, much to help," Sarah nodded, surprised by how her perception of Edmund Carter had evolved over the past days. The stuffy, proper banker who had irritated her with his persistent courtship had revealed depths of character she hadn't anticipated. "He was Thomas's friend before becoming mine," she replied. "I think he feels he's fulfilling a promise." Naicho made a sound that might have been amusement. "Tells himself that. Easier than admitting heart's truth." Before Sarah could respond to this unexpectedly perceptive observation, Rusty suddenly raised his head, ears pricked forward. A low growl rumbled in his throat, not the aggressive warning he gave for strangers, but an alert of uncertain threat. Naicho went completely still, head slightly tilted in a listening posture that reminded Sarah of a deer sensing danger. Then, with fluid motion belying his recent injuries, he moved toward the cavern entrance, signaling for Sarah to remain back. She ignored the instruction, drawing her revolver as she followed him to a position that offered a view of the canyon. Approach while maintaining cover. For several minutes, they waited in tense silence, straining to detect whatever had alerted Rusty's keen senses. The first indication came as a subtle shift in the quality of light, a momentary shadow passing across the canyon wall where no cloud had crossed the sun. Then, silently as mist settling into a valley, figures appeared among the rocks, flanking the approach to their cavern. 5 Apache warriors materialized from surroundings where Sarah would have sworn no one could hide. Their faces were painted with red and black designs that transformed human features into something otherworldly and terrifying. Each carried multiple weapons, bows, lances, knives, positioned for immediate use. But it was the sixth figure who commanded attention, emerging last from the shadows with the controlled power of a predator, confident in its dominance. Taller than the others, with a bearing that radiated authority, the warrior wore a single eagle feather secured in a band around his head. His chest crossed with bandoliers of ammunition for the modern rifle held casually in his hands. "Nantan," Naicho said softly, stepping forward into the open space before the cavern. For a moment that stretched like an eternity, the brothers regarded each other across the distance, one wounded but healing, standing beside a white woman with her revolver still drawn, the other surrounded by warriors, prepared for immediate violence, his expression unreadable beneath the ritual paint that marked a war chief on campaign. Then Nantan spoke a single word in Apache. Whatever it meant caused an immediate reaction among his warriors, who lowered their weapons slightly, though they remained vigilant. Naicho responded in their shared language, his words flowing too quickly for Sarah to catch any of the few Apache phrases she recognized. As he spoke, Nantan's gaze shifted to her, dark eyes assessing with penetrating intensity. Conscious that her next actions might determine not just her fate, but potentially that of many others, Sarah slowly holstered her revolver, then reached beneath her collar to withdraw the woven leather token Naicho had given her. She held it visible in her open palm, then spoke the phrase he had taught her, "Ana-i Naicho." Nantan's expression flickered with what might have been a surprise. He responded with a rapid series of questions directed at his brother. Naicho answered at length, occasionally gesturing towards Sarah or pointing to his healing wounds. The tension in the canyon was palpable as this exchange continued. Sarah remained still, recognizing that this moment balanced on a knife's edge between potential peace and immediate violence. The Apache warriors watched her with unwavering attention, their weapons still ready despite being lowered. Finally, Nantan stepped forward, crossing half the distance between them. He spoke directly to Sarah in accented but clear English. "My brother says you saved his life when others of your kind would have taken it, that you risk your own safety to help prevent greater bloodshed." His tone revealed nothing of whether he believed this assessment. Why would a white woman help an Apache scout? Why take such a risk? It was the essential question, one Sarah had asked herself repeatedly since finding Naicho wounded beside her storage shed. The answer had evolved with each passing day, becoming clearer as events unfolded. "Because justice matters more than the color of one's skin," she replied, meeting his gaze directly. "Because Lieutenant Barrett is deliberately creating conflict to profit from Apache suffering. And because your brother carries proof that could stop a war before it begins, if the right people see it." Nantan studied her face with the same penetrating intensity his brother had shown. Whatever he sought, fear, deception, weakness, he apparently did not find it. After a long moment, he turned back to Naicho and spoke again in Apache. Naicho responded by withdrawing the oilskin packet containing Barrett's scalp payment ledger. He handed it to his brother, who examined the document with careful attention, his expression darkening as he absorbed its contents. When he looked up again, the war chief's eyes burned with controlled fury. "This man Barrett takes scalps of our children for gold?" "Yes," Sarah confirmed, "and he orchestrated the massacre at Whitetail Creek to provoke your people into attacks that would justify removing all Apache from the territory." Nantan was silent for a long moment, his face revealing nothing of the calculations surely racing through his mind. When he finally spoke, his voice was measured, but carried the weight of absolute authority. "You will tell me everything. From the beginning, leave nothing hidden." He gestured toward the cavern entrance. "Then we will decide if white woman's justice is worth pursuing before Apache justice claims what is owed in blood." As the war party followed them into the cavern, warriors positioning themselves strategically around the perimeter while Nantan seated himself directly across the fire pit from Sarah. She realized they had reached the pivotal moment that would determine countless lives. Either Nantan would be convinced that pursuing Barrett through official channels offered better hope for his people than immediate violent retribution, or by nightfall, raids would begin across the territory that would trigger the very war they sought to prevent. The next few hours would determine which path the future would take. Sarah gathered her thoughts, preparing to present their case to a man who had every reason to disbelieve anything a white person told him, and whose decision would shape the destiny of everyone in the Arizona territory. The cavern fell into tense silence as Sarah finished recounting everything that had transpired since finding Nicho wounded at her ranch. She had spoken for nearly an hour, detailing Barrett's corruption, the evidence they had gathered, and their plan to reach the territorial governor. Nantan had listened without interruption, his face revealing nothing of his thoughts as she spoke. Now, he sat in contemplative silence, the scalp payment ledger open before him, its damning contents illuminated by the small fire between them. His warriors remained positioned around the perimeter of the cavern, shadows playing across their painted faces as they awaited their chief's response. Finally, Nantan looked up, his gaze moving deliberately from Sarah to his brother before settling. On the ledger again. "This paper shows great evil," he acknowledged, his deep voice resonating in the confined space. "But papers have been used against Apache before. White man's writing says one thing when spoken words promise another." "This is different," Sarah insisted. "Barrett's own handwriting documents his crimes. Combined with the financial records Edmund Carter discovered, it creates a case that even his allies couldn't dismiss." Nantan's expression hardened. "You speak of justice through white man's law, yet my people lie dead at Whitetail Creek. Children who will never grow to adulthood. Mothers who will birth no more children. What justice exists for them in the governor's office or army court?" It was the central question, one without an easy answer. Sarah chose her words carefully, aware that Nantan's decision hung on how he received her response. True justice would restore their lives, but that's beyond any court's power. What remains possible is preventing more deaths, both Apache and settler, by stopping Barrett before his plan succeeds. She met Nantan's intense gaze. "The territorial governor has authority to remove Barrett from command and order an investigation that could lead to his execution for murder." "If the governor believes the evidence," Nantan countered. "If papers reach him before Barrett creates more lies." Many ifs in this path. Nacho, who had remained largely silent during Sarah's explanation, now spoke to his brother in Apache. Though Sarah couldn't understand the words, their effect on Nantan was visible. A subtle shift in his posture, a flicker of consideration in his expression. When Nacho finished, Nantan responded briefly, then turned back to Sarah. "My brother says you are a woman of honor who risks her place among her own people to stand against wrongdoing. That such courage deserves respect." His eyes narrowed slightly. "He also says Barrett prepares to search your lands today. That time grows short for any path we choose." One of the warriors positioned near the cavern entrance moved suddenly, approaching Nantan with urgent purpose. He spoke rapidly in Apache, gesturing toward the canyon beyond. Nantan rose in a single fluid motion, signaling his warriors with quick hand movements that sent them flowing toward defensive positions throughout the cavern. To Sarah he spoke with calm authority. Riders approached the canyon, 6, maybe 8, moving with purpose, not routine patrol. Sarah's heart pounded against her ribs. Barrett's search parties. They've expanded their search area faster than Edmund anticipated. "They have tracked you here?" Nantan asked sharply. "It's possible," Sarah admitted. Or they may simply be checking all major terrain features systematically. Nantan conferred briefly with the scout who had reported the approaching riders, then made a swift decision. We move deeper into the canyon. There is place my people have used for generations when pursued. Hidden chamber accessible only through underwater passage. Sarah glanced at Naicho, whose recent wounds made swimming potentially dangerous. He read her concern and shook his head. It can manage. Wound is healing well. Working with practiced efficiency, the Apache warriors gathered their minimal supplies while erasing all evidence of their presence in the cavern. Sarah marveled at their methodical thoroughness. Within minutes, the fire was extinguished, ashes scattered and cooled, every footprint swept away with branches. They moved deeper into the canyon system, following a twisting path that descended steadily along the course of the underground stream. The passage narrowed until they were walking single file through corridors barely wide enough for shoulders to pass. Above them, the strip of visible sky gradually disappeared as the canyon walls closed overhead, transforming their route into a genuine cave system. The sound of running water grew louder as they progressed, until they emerged into a larger chamber, dominated by a dark pool. Water flowed into it from a narrow crevice, then disappeared beneath the far wall through an opening that appeared completely submerged. Underwater path, Nantan explained, already removing his rifle and ammunition bandoliers. Short distance, 10, maybe 12 strokes, opens to a hidden chamber beyond. The warriors began preparing immediately, waterproofing essential items in oilskin pouches, similar to the one that had protected Barrett's ledger. Sarah knelt to comfort Rusty, who was eyeing the water with evident suspicion. "He can swim?" Nantan asked, noticing her concern. "Yes, but he won't understand how to follow underwater." Sarah stroked the dog's head, wishing she could explain the necessity. Nantan considered the animal briefly, then spoke to one of his warriors, who nodded and approached Rusty with a strip of leather. With surprisingly gentle movements, he fashioned a makeshift harness that could be used to guide the dog through the underwater passage. "Nashota will bring the dog," Nantan explained. "He has led horses through similar paths in times of great danger." As the final preparations were completed, Sarah could hear faint echoes of voices reverberating through the canyon passages behind them. Barrett's men, drawing closer. Time was running short. One by one, the Apache warriors slipped into the dark water and disappeared beneath the rock wall. Naicho went before Sarah, demonstrating that despite his healing wound, he could manage the underwater passage. His brother Nantan waited until last, positioning himself to ensure everyone passed safely through. When Sarah's turn came, she took a deep breath and plunged into the cold water. The shock of it momentarily disoriented her, but she forced herself to focus, kicking downward to find the submerged opening. Her hands found the smooth stone edges of a tunnel just large enough for a person to pass through. With powerful strokes, she propelled herself forward into complete darkness. For a terrifying moment, she felt the press of stone on all sides, water filling her ears and nose, lungs beginning to burn. Then her head broke the surface on the other side, and she gasped for air, blinking water from her eyes as she oriented herself in the new space. The chamber beyond the underwater passage was unlike anything Sarah had ever seen. A high-ceilinged cavern stretched before her, illuminated by shafts of sunlight filtering through narrow fissures in the rock high above. The underground stream continued through it, creating a small beach of smooth stones where Naicho and the other warriors were already gathering. Moments later, Nashota emerged with a sputtering but intact Rusty, the dog shaking water from his coat as soon as he reached the stone beach. Nantan was the last to surface, moving immediately to confer with his scouts, who were already scaling the chamber walls to reach observation points near the light fissures. "They will not find entrance," he stated with confidence, helping Sarah to her feet. Even if they search the entire canyon, underwater path remains secret. Sarah wrung water from her clothing as best she could, grateful for the relative warmth of the hidden chamber. What now? We can't stay here indefinitely. We wait, Nantan replied simply. See if Barrett's men leave or establish a search camp. Then decide. The waiting proved more difficult than the flight had been. Hours passed with agonizing slowness as they listened to occasional distant voices echoing through the rock. From the warrior observers positioned at the high fissures, they learned that a thorough search of the main canyon was underway. Barrett's men combing every visible cave and crevice with methodical determination. As evening approached, bringing deeper shadows to their hidden sanctuary, one of the scouts descended with fresh information. Barrett himself had arrived with additional men, establishing a base camp at the canyon entrance. Lanterns now illuminated the main cavern area they had abandoned earlier, and soldiers were settling in for what appeared to be an extended search operation. He knows, Sarah said quietly to Naicho and Nantan. Or at least strongly suspects. He wouldn't commit this many resources otherwise. Nantan nodded grimly. Barrett hunts with purpose. Will not leave until finds what he seeks. What about Edmund? Sarah asked suddenly, concern flashing through her. If Barrett suspects my involvement, he might also suspect Edmund's. Banker. Friend took great risk, Naicho acknowledged. If Barrett questions him, the implications hung heavily in the air. Carter had no protection, no hidden canyon retreat, no warrior allies. If Barrett turned his suspicions toward the banker, Edmund would face the lieutenant's wrath alone. Nantan had been listening to this exchange with thoughtful attention. Now he spoke with the decisive authority that marked his leadership. Situation has changed. We can no longer wait for Barrett to make mistakes. Must act before more lives are threatened. He gestured toward the underwater passage. Tonight, when darkness complete, we move, take evidence to this governor ourselves. Through Barrett's men, Sarah asked, surprised by the boldness of the proposal. A cold smile touched Nantan's lips. Not through, above and beyond. They watched the canyon floor, not high paths only Apache use. He outlined his plan with strategic precision, using ancient hunting trails that traversed the canyon rims, paths too narrow and precarious for cavalry horses. They would bypass Barrett's perimeter entirely. By dawn, they could be well on their way to Tucson, traveling across the country, rather than following established roads where Barrett might have posted observers. The governor arrives in Tucson tomorrow night, according to Edmund's information, Sarah noted. If we travel without stopping, we might reach the city by the following morning, just as he begins his meetings. 2 warriors will go to the settlement first, Nantan added. Watch for Barrett's men, ensure path clear to the governor's location. It was a daring plan, perhaps their only viable option given Barrett's determination to find them. Yet Sarah couldn't help worrying about those left behind, particularly Edmund, now vulnerable in Copper Springs. What about Edmund? She asked. Barrett may already be questioning him. Nantan considered this concern with unexpected seriousness. Banker took risk for brother and for justice. Apache, do not forget such courage. He spoke briefly to one of his warriors, who nodded in acknowledgement. Kitan will go to the settlement tonight. Watch over my banker friend. Warn him if danger approaches. Sarah was touched by this gesture, a warrior dispatched solely to protect someone Nantan had never met, based entirely on Edmund's assistance. To Naicho, it spoke to a code of honor that transcended the boundaries dividing their peoples. As night settled fully over the canyon, they completed preparations for their journey. The evidence against Barrett was secured in multiple waterproof pouches, distributed among several warriors, ensuring that even if some were captured, others might still reach Tucson with the vital documentation. When it was time to depart, they re-entered the cold water of the underground stream, passing once more through the submerged tunnel. This time, Sarah found the passage less terrifying, her movements more controlled as she navigated the underwater path. They emerged into the larger canyon system under complete darkness, the night sky obscured by clouds that promised rain by morning. The absence of moonlight worked to their advantage, allowing them to move within yards of Barrett's sentries without detection. Guided by Nantan and his scouts, they began the treacherous ascent toward the canyon rim. The path, if it could even be called that, was little more than a series of narrow ledges and handholds, invisible to anyone not intimately familiar with the terrain. Sarah followed Nitro closely, mimicking his movements as they climbed in. Near total darkness, halfway up the canyon wall, they paused on a ledge barely wide enough for single file standing. Below them, the glow of Barrett's campfires illuminated the main cavern entrance. Sarah could make out soldiers moving about, their voices occasionally carrying upward in fragments of conversation. Check the entire southern branch. Lieutenant, wants the woman taken alive if possible. Bounty for the Apache scout, dead or... The partial phrases confirmed Barrett's focus and the danger they faced if captured. The climb resumed with renewed urgency, each of them understanding that discovery now would mean disaster not just for themselves, but for everyone who might suffer if Barrett's scheme succeeded. When they finally reached the canyon rim, Sarah's muscles burned with exertion, her hands raw from gripping stone edges in the darkness. But there was no time to rest. Nantan immediately led them away from the rim, moving parallel to the canyon, but far enough back that they wouldn't be silhouetted against the night sky should any of Barrett's men look upward. They traveled through the night without stopping, maintaining a grueling pace that tested Sarah's endurance. Nantan's warriors moved with silent efficiency, occasionally vanishing ahead to scout their route before returning with wordless signals that indicated the path remained clear. Dawn found them miles from the canyon, crossing a high desert plateau that offered little cover but provided the most direct route toward Tucson. As the rising sun illuminated their surroundings, Sarah could see the full war party clearly for the first time since their underwater passage. 8 warriors, including Nantan, all moving with the fluid grace of men accustomed to covering vast distances on foot. By midday, they had reached a series of low hills that provided some shelter from both sun and potential observers. Nantan called a brief halt, allowing them to rest and consume small amounts of the dried meat and pinole mixture the warriors carried for sustenance during long journeys. As they rested in the shade of a rocky overhang, Sarah found herself seated near Nantan, who was studying the terrain ahead with focused attention. Despite their hours of travel together, this was the first opportunity for direct conversation since leaving the canyon. "Thank you," she said simply, "for believing me, for believing in the possibility of justice through means other than war." Nantan's expression remained inscrutable as he considered her words. "I have not abandoned war," he clarified, "only delayed it to see if another path might better serve my people." His dark eyes met hers directly. "If your governor dismisses evidence or shields Barrett from consequences, blood will still answer blood." It was a sobering reminder that their alliance was conditional, a temporary convergence of interests rather than a fundamental shift in the relationship between their peoples. Sarah nodded, acknowledging both his position and the fairness of his warning. "And if the governor acts as we hope?" she asked. "If Barrett faces proper justice for his crimes?" Something subtle shifted in Nantan's expression. Not quite a softening, but perhaps a willingness to consider possibilities beyond the immediate crisis. "Then Apache will know at least one white leader keeps word. Small beginning, perhaps." He returned his gaze to the distant horizon. "My father believed peace was possible between our peoples. Died with that belief when soldiers opened fire during parley. Since then, I have seen little to suggest he was right. Until Naicho found shelter with a white woman who chose justice over safety, Sarah observed quietly. Nantan glanced at his brother, who was checking his wound nearby. One person does not change the course of the river, but perhaps it shows where stones might be placed to alter flow. He rose, signaling an end to their rest period. We will see what your governor's actions reveal about white man's justice. Their journey resumed with the same relentless pace. As afternoon faded toward evening, distant thunderheads began building on the horizon. A monsoon storm gathering. Strength. The promised rain would complicate their travel, but might also reduce visibility for any pursuers Barrett might have sent after them. By nightfall, they had covered an impressive distance, the lights of smaller settlements occasionally, visible far to their west as they maintained their cross-country route. According to Nantan's calculation, they would reach Tucson's outskirts by mid-morning if they continued through the night. During a brief rest in the darkness, Naicho approached Sarah with a small object in his hand, a carved wooden pendant suspended. On a leather cord, protection symbol, he explained, offering it to her. More permanent than the token I gave before. Marks you as a friend to Apache, may be needed in the days ahead. Sarah accepted the gift with appropriate solemnity, placing it around her neck alongside the token she already wore. The gesture touched her, a tangible recognition of the unusual bond that had formed through their shared ordeal. No matter what happens in Tucson, she said, I won't regret helping you, even knowing all it might cost me. Naicho studied her face in the darkness. Cost is high. Your people will not understand. Some choices make your path forward clear by burning the path behind you, Sarah replied, thinking of all she had left behind, her ranch, her precarious social position, the life she had built since Thomas's death. None of it could be reclaimed now, regardless of the outcome in Tucson. As midnight approached, the storm that had been building finally broke over them. Lightning illuminated the landscape in stark flashes, followed by rolling thunder and sheets of rain that turned the desert floor to slick mud within minutes. They continued forward despite the deluge, using the storm's fury as additional cover for their approach toward Tucson. The rain continued unabated through the remainder of the night, soaking them to the skin, but failing to slow their determined progress. As false dawn began to lighten the eastern sky, they reached a vantage point that offered their first clear view of Tucson in the distance, the territorial capital spread across a basin still shrouded in pre-dawn shadows. Nantan signaled a halt, gathering his warriors for a final council before they approached the settlement. The plan they had formulated during their journey was straightforward, but fraught with risk. 2 warriors would enter the city first, locating the governor's quarters and assessing security arrangements. Sarah, Naicho, and Nantan would follow with the evidence, while the remaining warriors established a defensive perimeter that could cover their retreat if necessary. As they prepared for this final phase of their mission, Sarah found herself hoping that Edmund Carter had remained safe. In their absence, so much depended on factors beyond their control, whether Barrett had identified the banker as an accomplice, whether the governor would be receptive to their evidence, whether they could even reach him before Barrett's influence poisoned the proceedings. The sun broke finally over the eastern mountains, illuminating Tucson's adobe buildings with golden light that belied the tension of their mission. With silent signals that spoke of years of coordinated action, Nantan's scouts departed first, moving toward the city with such skill that they seemed to disappear into the landscape despite the relative openness of their approach. Now came the waiting, perhaps the most difficult part of all. Within hours, they would know whether their desperate journey had been in vain, or whether justice might finally be brought to bear against a man whose ambition and greed had already cost so many lives. Sarah watched the city slowly awakening in the distance, knowing that somewhere within its streets, The territorial governor was preparing for meetings that would shape the future of both Apache and settler in the Arizona Territory. Whether that future would bring war or the possibility of peace now rested in their hands, and in their ability to reach the governor before Barrett's machinations made conflict inevitable. The final phase of their desperate plan was about to begin. The scouts returned as the morning sun climbed higher, bringing both valuable intelligence and troubling news. The territorial governor had indeed arrived in Tucson the previous evening, and was scheduled to meet with military officials that very morning, before conferring with Apache representatives in the afternoon. "Governor stays at Douglas Hotel," reported the taller of the two scouts, a warrior named Kitchi. "Many soldiers guard building. Barrett is not seen, but army officers gather." "And the other matter?" Nantan asked. Kitchi's expression darkened. "Bank closed. Sign says, due to the sudden illness of the proprietor. Town speaks of a banker taken by soldiers yesterday for questioning, not returned." Sarah felt as if the ground had dropped beneath her feet. Edmund had been arrested, almost certainly. On Barrett's orders, the lieutenant was moving aggressively to silence anyone who might interfere with his plans. "We must assume Barrett knows everything Carter could tell him," she said, forcing herself to think strategically, despite her concern for Edmund. "Which means he'll be expecting us to approach the governor." Nantan nodded grimly. "More patrols. Noticed entering town as we watched. Barrett prepares a trap." They retreated to a more sheltered position among rocks overlooking the city, considering their limited options. Direct approach to the governor now seemed impossible. With Barrett's men specifically watching for them, they would likely be intercepted before reaching the Douglas Hotel. "Perhaps divide forces," Nicho suggested. "Small group creates distraction, while others bring evidence to the governor." Nantan considered this, but ultimately shook his head. Too risky. Barrett would recognize diversion tactic, and the governor might refuse the meeting if Apache warriors caused disturbance in town. As they debated alternatives, Sarah's attention was drawn to activity in the streets below. A procession was forming, carriages preparing to depart from the Douglas Hotel, escorted by mounted soldiers. "The governor's leaving," she realized, pointing toward the activity. "That must be his entourage." Kitchi, whose eyesight was exceptionally keen, studied the procession carefully. Governor and military men heading toward the north edge of town, where territorial offices stand. This development altered their tactical situation significantly. If the governor was relocating to the territorial offices, it created both new challenges and potential opportunities. The government building would have official security, but might not be as thoroughly covered by Barrett's personal forces as the hotel had been. "I know that building," Sarah said, recalling her single previous visit to Tucson 2 years earlier with Thomas. "It stands slightly apart from other structures, with a courtyard in the back that adjoins open country." A new plan began to take shape, daring but potentially viable. While the governor and his military advisors met inside, Sarah could approach through the rear courtyard, using the credentials of a rancher's widow with legitimate concerns about Apache relations to request an audience. Meanwhile, Nantan and his warriors would position themselves in the surrounding terrain, ready to intervene if Barrett's men attempted to prevent her from reaching the governor. "I will go with you," Nicho insisted when Sarah explained her intention. "Evidence must be presented by one who witnessed Barrett's crimes directly." Nantan studied his brother with concern. Despite Nicho's remarkable recovery, his wound still limited his mobility. In a situation that might require quick escape, this could prove fatal. "Too dangerous," the war chief objected. "Barrett wants you dead more than any of us." "Which is precisely why I must go," Nicho countered. "My presence proves the truth of accusations. White woman's word alone may not convince the governor that the army officer betrays both peoples." The logic was sound, if perilous. After further discussion, a modified plan was agreed upon. Sarah and Naicho would approach the territorial offices, together timing their arrival to coincide with a midday break in the governor's schedule that Kitchi had overheard mentioned. Nantan and 4 warriors would secure positions overlooking the approach, while the remaining scouts would watch for Barrett's movements in the town. "If we are not seen leaving the building by sunset," Sarah said, meeting Nantan's eyes directly, "do not attempt rescue. Take the evidence to the newspaper office in Tucson instead." She had noticed the Arizona Citizen's office during their observation of the town. "The editor has a reputation for independence from mining interests." Nantan's expression revealed reluctance, but he eventually nodded in agreement. "Sun crosses 3 hand-widths in sky. Then we find a different path for justice." As the morning progressed toward midday, Sarah and Nacho prepared for their approach. They had no opportunity to change into cleaner clothing after their grueling journey, but they did what they could to present a less threatening appearance. Sarah rearranged her hair and cleaned the worst of the trail dust from her face and hands. Nacho removed his bandana and hunting knife, leaving only the essential evidence concealed beneath his shirt. The territorial offices stood on a small rise at the northern edge of Tucson, a modest adobe structure distinguished by its red-tiled roof and the territorial flag hanging limply in the still midday air. As Sarah had remembered, the building featured a rear courtyard accessible from the surrounding scrubland without necessitating passage through the main streets. Their approach was timed to coincide with the changing of the military guard that Kitchi had observed during his reconnaissance. As 2 soldiers departed and their replacements had not yet arrived, Sarah and Naicho crossed the final exposed ground to the courtyard wall, then slipped inside through a service gate. The courtyard was deserted except for a young clerk sorting documents at a small table in the shade. He looked up in surprise as they approached, clearly not expecting visitors from the rear entrance. "Ma'am?" he questioned, taking in Sarah's disheveled appearance with confusion. His eyes widened further as he noticed Naicho. "This area isn't... I must see the governor immediately," Sarah interrupted, her voice carrying the natural authority she had developed through years of independent ranch management. "It's a matter of territorial security that cannot wait." The clerk appeared flustered, glancing between them uncertainly. "The governor is in meetings all day with military advisors. Perhaps if you return tomorrow..." "Young man," Sarah said, stepping closer, "I have ridden for 3 days through Apache territory to deliver evidence of corruption that threatens every settlement in Arizona. People have already died because of this information being suppressed. I need to see Governor Safford now." Her intensity clearly unsettled the clerk, who hesitated before responding. I can't interrupt the current meeting, but there's a scheduled recess in 20 minutes. If you'll wait in the anteroom, I can inform his secretary of your request." It was the best they could hope for under the circumstances. Sarah nodded her agreement, and the clerk led them through a side door into a modestly furnished waiting room. As he departed to inform the governor's staff of their presence, Sarah and Naicho exchanged glances of cautious optimism. They had successfully entered the building without confrontation, the first hurdle cleared. The waiting room featured a single window overlooking the main street, allowing Sarah to observe without being easily spotted from outside. What she saw sent a chill through her veins. Lieutenant Barrett himself was dismounting before the building's main entrance, accompanied by 2 other officers. They had arrived for military consultation with the governor. "Barrett is here," she whispered urgently to Nacho, who immediately positioned himself away from the door where he would not be immediately visible to anyone entering. The minutes that followed were among the most tense Sarah had ever experienced. From beyond the closed door, They could hear voices in the main corridor, official greetings, the sound of boots on tile floors, doors opening and closing as the military delegation was escorted into the building. At one point, footsteps paused, just outside their waiting room, and Sarah held her breath, certain they were about to be discovered. But the moment passed, the footsteps continuing down the hallway toward what she presumed was the governor's office. When the clerk finally returned, Sarah had composed herself, though her heart still pounded against her ribs. The governor's secretary says he can spare 10 minutes during the recess, the young man informed them. I'm to bring you to the office when the current meeting concludes. Sarah nodded her thanks, then asked casually, I noticed Lieutenant Barrett arriving. Is he part of the military delegation meeting with the governor? The clerk seemed surprised by her knowledge of Barrett. Yes, ma'am. He's presenting a report on Apache activities in the Southeastern Territory. Actually, the lieutenant asked to be notified of any unusual visitors today. Perhaps I should mention— That won't be necessary, Sarah interrupted smoothly. The lieutenant and I are acquainted. In fact, part of my business with the governor concerns his report. I'll be happy to speak with him afterward. The deflection worked. The clerk nodded and departed, leaving them alone once more. As soon as the door closed, Sarah turned to Naicho. Barrett is presenting his report now, likely laying the groundwork to justify military action against your people. When the meeting breaks and the clerk comes for us, Barrett might see you. Naicho's expression remained calm, despite the danger. Then we face him directly. With the governor present, Barrett cannot simply kill us without revealing our true nature. Before Sarah could respond, the door to the waiting room opened. Instead of the clerk, Edmund Carter stood in the doorway, his face bruised, one arm in a crude sling. Behind him loomed a cavalry sergeant, hand resting meaningfully on his sidearm. Sarah, Edmund said, his voice strained but steady. I'm afraid I've made a terrible mistake. The sergeant pushed past him into the room, taking in Sarah and Naicho with a cold professional assessment. Lieutenant Barrett thought you might attempt to approach the governor. He'll be pleased to know his assessment was correct. Edmund's eyes conveyed a silent apology. The bandage on his arm was spotted with blood, and a dark bruise spread across his left cheekbone. Whatever resistance he had offered to Barrett's questioning had clearly been met with violence. The lieutenant is concluding his presentation to the governor, the sergeant continued. He asked that you both be detained until he can address your concerns personally. The slight pause conveyed volumes about what Barrett's personal attention might entail. Sarah's mind raced through options, each seemingly worse than the last. The sergeant stood between them and the exit, his hand still on his weapon. Edmund remained in the doorway, his expression a mask of regret and pain. Beyond him, Sarah could see another soldier in the corridor, effectively blocking any escape. A route, then, unexpectedly, Edmund straightened his posture. "Sergeant," he said, his voice taking on the authoritative tone he typically used for bank business, "I believe I heard Lieutenant Barrett being called from the governor's office. Something about an urgent message from Fort Bowie." The sergeant frowned, glancing toward the hallway. "I didn't hear anything." "Perhaps you should check," Edmund suggested. The lieutenant was quite clear that any communications from Fort Bowie were to be brought to him immediately, given the Apache situation. The sergeant hesitated, clearly weighing his orders to guard the prisoners against the possibility of failing to deliver important information to his commanding officer. After a moment's consideration, he stepped toward the doorway. "Keep an eye on them," he instructed Edmund, before moving into the hallway to confer with the other soldier. The instant the sergeant was beyond the threshold, Edmund moved with surprising quickness for an injured man. He slammed the door shut, turning the key that remained in the lock. "We have perhaps 2 minutes before they break through or come around through another entrance," he said urgently. The governor is in the large office at the end of the main corridor. Barrett has been with him for the past hour, poisoning the well with fabricated reports of Apache atrocities. Edmund, your arm. What happened? Sarah asked, even as she and Nicho moved toward the window to assess it as an escape route. Barrett's methods of questioning are not gentle, Edmund replied grimly, but I managed to convince him I knew less than I did. When he brought me here to help identify you if you appeared, I saw an opportunity. The window overlooked a narrow side alley rather than the main street, offering a potential escape route less likely to be watched by Barrett's men. Nicho had already begun working the latch, which had swollen in the frame and resisted opening. You should come with us, Sarah urged Edmund. Barrett will know you helped us escape. Edmund shook his head. I'll create additional confusion to cover your departure. The territorial auditor arrived with the governor's party, a man who once denied Barrett alone at my recommendation. If I can reach him with what I know about Barrett's financial transactions. A heavy thud against the door interrupted him, the sergeant beginning his attempt to break through. The wood creaked, but held for the moment. Nicho finally forced the window open. Quickly, he directed, helping Sarah through the narrow opening. Edmund handed her a folded paper through the window. The names of mining executives who've been paying Barrett, he explained hurriedly. Bank records showing the transactions. Get this to the governor along with your other evidence. Another crash against the door, louder this time. Wood splintered. Around the lock. Go, Edmund urged. I'll find another way to help. Nicho slipped through the window after Sarah, dropping silently into the alley below. They moved immediately toward the rear of the building, hoping to circle around to the main entrance, where they might still intercept the governor during the recess. As they rounded the corner of the building, they nearly collided with a well-dressed man accompanied by a single aide. The man stepped back in surprise, taking in their disheveled appearance with obvious confusion. "What is the meaning of this?" he demanded, his voice carrying the unmistakable authority of high office. Sarah made an intuitive leap. Governor Safford. The man's eyebrows rose slightly. I am Governor Safford. Who are you, madam, and why are you accosting me in this manner? It was an incredible stroke of fortune. The governor had apparently stepped outside for air during the meeting recess, using the side door that led to this secluded area of the grounds. My name is Sarah Mitchell, she began quickly. This is Nicho, an Apache scout formerly employed by the army. We have evidence that Lieutenant Barrett has been orchestrating attacks on both settlers and Apache, profiting from scalp bounties and land speculation. The governor's expression shifted from indignation to guarded interest. Those are extraordinary accusations against an army officer, Mrs. Mitchell. With extraordinary evidence to support them, Sarah countered, nodding to Nicho, who withdrew. The oilskin packet containing Barrett's scalp payment ledger. Before the governor could examine the document, a shout came from around the building. The sergeant had discovered their escape route and was raising the alarm. Governor, Sarah said urgently, Lieutenant Barrett has been lying to you about the Apache situation. He massacred peaceful families at Whitetail Creek to provoke a war that would benefit his mining investors. I have financial records proving his corruption. She thrust Edmund's documents toward him alongside Nicho's evidence. Governor Safford hesitated only briefly before accepting the papers. He was a politician, but also a man known for personal integrity. The specific details Sarah had provided, names, locations, financial connections, lent credibility to her claims. Jenkins, he said to his aide, escort these two to my private office through the rear entrance. I want to hear their full account without interruption. To Sarah and Nicho, he added, if your evidence supports these accusations, Lieutenant Barrett will face appropriate consequences. I will not have corrupt officers endangering the territory's fragile peace for personal gain. The aide led them quickly toward a side entrance as the governor himself turned to intercept the approaching sergeant. They could hear Safford's authoritative, Voice cutting through the soldier's excited report. Sergeant, I believe Lieutenant Barrett is looking for these individuals. Please inform him that they are now under my personal protection as witnesses in a territorial investigation. I will speak with him momentarily. The private office was a simply furnished room at the rear of the building, featuring a desk stacked with territorial maps and correspondence. Jenkins, the governor's aide, offered them seats before departing to inform Safford they were secured. Through the window, Sarah could see increased activity in the courtyard. Soldiers conferring urgently, messengers being dispatched. Barrett would soon know they had reached the governor with their evidence. We did it, she said quietly to Naicho, the reality of their achievement beginning to settle over her exhausted mind. The governor has the evidence. Naicho remained cautious. Having evidence and acting on it are different matters. Barrett has powerful friends, but so does the governor, Sarah countered, and unlike Barrett, Safford's authority is legitimate and public. He can't simply bury this information without consequences to his own position. The door opened to admit Governor Safford, his expression grave as he carried their documents. He closed the door firmly behind him before addressing them. I've reviewed these materials, he began without preamble. If authentic, they represent the most serious breach of military conduct I've encountered during my administration. He focused on Naicho. You were present at Whitetail Creek after the massacre? Not during, Naicho clarified. I was on a scout mission, returned to find families killed, including my brother's wife and son. When I questioned the official report that the camp harbored hostile warriors, Barrett ordered my execution along with other scouts who knew the truth. And you, Mrs. Mitchell, how did you become involved in this matter? Sarah explained her role succinctly, finding Naicho wounded, learning of Barrett's corruption, and the subsequent events that had led them to Tucson. She included Edmund Carter's assistance and the banker's current perilous situation. The governor listened intently, asking occasional clarifying questions that revealed both intelligence and familiarity with territorial politics. When Sarah finished her account, he was silent for a long moment, considering implications beyond. The immediate situation. Barrett is waiting in my outer office, he finally said. He demands your detention as dangerous conspirators, spreading falsehoods about military operations. A hint of grim humor touched his expression. He seems quite insistent that I not listen to anything you might say, which only confirms his guilt, Sarah observed. Safford nodded. Indeed. His reaction upon learning you had reached me was revealing. He rose, moving to the window that overlooked the courtyard. There's another matter I must address. It appears a group of Apache warriors has been observed on the outskirts of Tucson. Barrett is demanding immediate military action against what he terms an imminent raid. Sarah and Naicho exchanged glances. Nantan's presence had been detected, potentially creating the very confrontation they had sought to prevent. Those warriors are led by my brother, Naicho explained. They await our return. If we do not emerge by sunset, they will seek different means of justice. Safford turned back to face them, his expression thoughtful. Then we have two immediate problems to resolve. Lieutenant Barrett's corruption and preventing an armed confrontation that could spark territory-wide conflict. The solution he proposed was bold but strategically sound. Barrett would be arrested immediately on charges of corruption, illegal bounty payments, and murder. Meanwhile, the governor himself would meet with Nantan under a flag of truce, acknowledging the legitimate grievances of the Apache while demonstrating commitment to justice by Barrett's public detention. It is a risk, Safford acknowledged. Meeting with a war chief outside established channels. But I've found honorable treatment often. Receives honorable response, regardless of whether one wears broadcloth or buckskin. Events moved swiftly after this decision. Barrett's arrest in the governor's outer office was a scene of barely controlled chaos, the lieutenant shouting accusations of conspiracy and threats of military reprisal even as he was disarmed and placed in custody. By mid-afternoon, Governor Safford, accompanied by Sarah, Nacho, and a small contingent of territorial officials, rode to the arranged meeting place on Tucson's northern outskirts. Nantan and his warriors appeared from the surrounding terrain, exactly as promised, approaching with dignified caution to the neutral ground established for the parley. The meeting that followed would later be recorded in territorial histories as the Tucson Accord, an unprecedented direct negotiation between the governor and an Apache war chief that established the framework for subsequent peace talks. Barrett's crimes were acknowledged, justice promised through territorial courts rather than military tribunals, and compensation agreed upon for the victims of Whitetail Creek. Most significantly, Nantan accepted the governor's personal guarantee that the evidence of mining interests' involvement in provoking Apache conflicts would be fully investigated, with perpetrators held accountable regardless of their wealth or position. As sunset painted the desert in hues of gold and crimson, Sarah found herself standing slightly apart from the historical proceedings, watching as men from opposing worlds found tentative common ground in their shared commitment to justice. Edmund Carter joined her, his arm properly bandaged now, his bruised face displaying the quiet satisfaction of a man who had chosen principle over safety. Barrett's financial partners are already being questioned, he informed her. The territorial auditor was particularly interested in certain land speculation schemes that coincided with army operations against Apache bands. What happens now? Sarah asked, her gaze moving between the departing Apache warriors and the territorial officials returning to Tucson. Edmund followed her gaze thoughtfully. For the territory? Perhaps a chance at the peace that reasonable people on both sides have always wanted. He hesitated before adding, "For you, that depends on what you want, Sarah." The question touched on uncertainties she had been avoiding confronting directly. Her ranch would still be there, but her place in the community had been irrevocably altered. Knowledge of her role in Barrett's downfall would eventually spread, marking her simultaneously as a hero to some and a traitor to others. "I don't know," she admitted. "I can't go back to what was before." "Perhaps you don't need to," Edmund suggested. Governor Safford mentioned the territory needs representatives who understand both settler and Apache perspectives, someone who has demonstrated commitment to justice rather than expedience. Before Sarah could respond, Nacho approached. His brother had already departed with their warriors, returning to the mountains with news of Barrett's arrest and the governor's commitment to investigate the Whitetail Creek massacre. "My brother says debt is paid," he told Sarah. "Life for life. Your courage balanced blood spilled at Whitetail Creek." The simplicity of this accounting struck Sarah as profoundly just, recognizing both the weight of what had been lost and the value of what had been saved through her actions. "And you?" she asked. "Will you return to your people?" Nacho glanced toward the distant mountains where Nantan had already disappeared. "For now, but Governor asks for Apache scouts he can trust when peace talks begin, to build bridge between worlds." A ghost of a smile touched his typically stoic features. "Perhaps territory needs bridges built by those who have crossed dangerous waters." As twilight deepened into true night, Sarah found herself contemplating a future far different from anything she had imagined when she first found a wounded Apache scout beside her storage shed. The path ahead remained uncertain, filled with challenges she could only dimly foresee, yet within that uncertainty lay something she had not experienced since Thomas's death, a sense of purpose larger than mere survival, a recognition that perhaps the frontier's greatest promise was not in the land itself, but in the possibility of creating something new from the collision of different worlds. Whether as a territorial representative, a mediator between cultures, or simply as a woman who had found her own definition of justice, Sarah Mitchell had discovered a truth that transcended the boundaries society had attempted to impose upon her. Courage was never wasted when spent in service of what was right, even when the cost seemed impossibly high. The wounded Apache scout she had nursed in secret had not only survived, but had transformed her life in ways neither could have imagined on that fateful night when she chose compassion over fear. Now, as Tucson's lights twinkled in the gathering darkness, Sarah faced the future with the same quiet determination that had carried her through those dangerous days, ready to build whatever bridges might be necessary in the territory she now understood was truly her home. Up next, you've got two more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hits the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.